There's a tropical storm going on, as you can hear. I'm in Pemutaran, which is the northwestern point of the Bali coast. 14th, 15th, I don't know what, of December. And today I'm going to do Doris's family. Doris's family is a bit complicated, but looking at the way you are and your physical build, it's Doris's family genes that you've got. Right, Doris Ada Ellen. She was born in about 1923. Gwilym David Jones, was born 12 years earlier. There was 12 years between Doris and Gwilym. So there is a bit of a difference. Doris's family, they come from the East End of London, Dalton, and the family name was Dalton. The family was run by patriarch granddad, Farf, is how Doris always referred to him, Farf. And he had the contract for catching rats in all the warehouses along the East End of London. Very, very wealthy family, mafiosi. You did not cross the Daltons, just like later on with gangsters in various other areas of London. Grandfather Dalton ran his part of the East End. Huge contract, rat catching, very large family, sons, daughters, who were all in the business. Everybody in the family was in the business. Very wealthy, as I said. The money wasn't in banks, in property or anything like that. It was all on the grandmother's fingers. As they made money, she would have another diamond ring bought, and that was the bank. The grandmother's, both of her hands were the bank. If anybody needed any money, they would go to Farf and say, I need this amount of money. The grandmother would select the equivalent value in diamonds on her fingers, throw one of the rings in the fire, and Doris said they never valued the gold in a ring, only the diamonds. And then when the fire was over, they would look through the embers and there would be the diamond. That would be given to the kid, go out and do whatever they needed to do. There were two daughters, Doris's mother and another aunt called Ada. I met Ada, she was 70 or 80 when I first met her, very bent over, but always had her marbles right to the very end. Always had her marbles and money stashed away, very similar to Doris, but she would have been Doris's aunt, her mother's sister. Doris's mother, and I have no idea what her name was, married a chap after the First World War who was not considered to be part of the family. He was a gentle, kind, caring man, and after the First World War came back with shell shock and was an item of fun for the family. They just tormented him in the corner until he went balmy and died in the end. But shell shock was something horrendous. Doris's mother couldn't understand it because it meant he couldn't support her, he couldn't be part of the family, he wasn't part of the mafia. So again, she just allowed all this to happen. And she, in fact, took to drink. She had 4 children. The oldest was Joan. Then there was George, Doris and Joe the youngest. Always the one, very last child and treasured and spoilt something rotten. But Joe treated his mother very badly, if you ask Doris. Doris wouldn't in the end go to see them because of the way Joe treated her. They lived in one of those East End blocks of flats with the long terraces, external terraces along the back and staircases, and she was on a very high floor. And by that time, she was very big, unable to move, never ever got out. And Joe would disappear with his mates and friends and just leave her there. So her and Doris didn't have a good relationship, and Doris and Joe at that time didn't have a decent relationship either, over the mother. The mother became a drunk, alcoholic. Joan never lived with them. The eldest, blonde, very pretty child always lived with the grandfather. So Doris was the eldest child of any note in the family, and she was left with this alcoholic mother. The mother is very similar to Rick, in as much as very sharp, knew everything that was going on, and she would send Doris out for alcohol when she was 6, 7, 8 years old. And she would be sent to an off licence to get the booze, where Doris knew there was going to be no money. She wasn't given any money, and she had to get this booze on tick. And she knew that when she got there, the chap would say, "Have you got any money?" And she would say, "No." "Can you put it on my mother's slate?" And he would say, "No." But she knew she had to go back with the booze, or she'd be knocked about. This is a 6, 7-year-old child. So she came up with whatever excuses she needed, and this is where Doris learnt to be so sharp, was her training by her mother. She had to get the booze out of these off licenses, these pubs, because she couldn't go back without it. When she went home, she would sit on the stairs and get her story organised, because she knew the cross-examination she would go through of who did you see, who saw, who knows, because getting this booze had to be secret as well. No one was to know that this mother had a drink problem. And so Doris would get her story correct. Then when she would go in, she'd hand over the booze, get knocked about a bit, and then the cross-examination would start. Who did you see? Where did you go? Which streets did you walk down? And as you know, your mother has some of that in her. The cross-examination of, I'm going to get the story right, nobody ever tells me anything, so I've got to get it out of people. That is Doris's mother to a T. So Doris was always brought up in that environment. Very deprived childhood, no money, because the Daltons had no way of giving them money because her father wasn't in the business. So she again would be sent to the grandfather every so often to say, "Can I have some money?" And Joan could have whatever she wanted. There she was, living in with the grandmother, dressed as a princess, and Doris was on, with her drunken mother, nothing. George left as soon as he could. Joe, well, Joe is just Joe. The war came, and Doris saw this as a way out. She trained as a welder, and was one of the first lady welders in England, and she ran a business for somebody in Soho, welding. The war came, and that business got the contract for, I think it was Hurricanes, and they would weld the escape staircases, the little metal staircases that got in and out of these Hurricanes and the big other bombers. So she was fully employed. They were employed on a piecework basis, so it's the number of these things that were made was what they earned their money on, and she did very well. And the boss found her extremely efficient, sharp, and put her in charge of a gang of welders. So she was an unusual thing at that time. She would go to work in London Across during the Blitz. She had to earn money. So she said she would walk through bomb sites where she'd seen a business and friends yesterday. Today there was nothing, just flattened building, friends gone, people dead. And that was, she said, her life. You just accepted it. For some reason, and I don't know the detail of this, Gwilym worked in this factory. He was never in the army during the war, I don't know why. Perhaps he was too young, I've no idea. But he wasn't called up into any regiments, army, navy or whatever. And he was taken to this place to work. and he became one of her gang. And she never found him very useful because Gwilym was not very practical. He, 12 years older than her, saw in her someone that he cherished and fell in love with, and week after week after week he would leave little presents for her. This drove her nuts, because all she was interested in was earning money, and he wasn't working fast enough on the pay scale to earn money. She was paid a percentage of whatever they earned. If he didn't make the staircases fast enough, she didn't earn money, so she wasn't very happy with Gwilym. But every day he would leave her a little present, little bunch of violets, a little bunch of flowers, week after week after week. He asked her to marry him God knows how many times, and every time she said no. He wasn't considered much of a catch by her family, but in the end she relented. God knows why, she just relented. He then went to work after the war for British Oxygen. He was very good at. He was a research engineer into vacuum technology. Very, very bright. Only academically. No common sense, no practical abilities of any kind, but as a researcher in vacuum technology, he found a little round peg for a round hole. They lived in Dalton and around the East End, Greenwich. They lived in a flat in Greenwich, and then BOC, the company he worked for, moved to Crawley in, I believe, 1951 or 52. The whole of Crawley was owned by the corporation, and they had a rented house down there, council house, and he came to Doris and said, "Shall we move?" And she said, "Okay, let's go." She didn't particularly want to. He'd been offered a post in Brighton, but refused to take it. He wouldn't go to Brighton, that was too far. But because the job in Crawley gave them a house, accommodation, and they were in quite a grimy flat, they decided yes. So they moved to Crawley, where he worked on the big industrial estate that had been created to support the town. Doris got a job with an employment agency because, of course, there was loads of work on this factory estate, and therefore employment agencies were very strong. It was called the Vera Sugg Agency, and she was just an interviewer, and then gradually she took over the running of it, never took over the management. Vera Sugg was far too sharp for that, would never let Doris buy her out, so a percentage of the money always went to, I can't remember what a chap's name was, but he ran this on behalf of Vera Sugg. Very, very clever man. All of Doris's wiles never got over him, so she was working, she got a percentage of the takings herself, but a percentage always went to this sleeping partner, whatever she did, and she hated it. One of the women she worked with, Helen, was the bookkeeper, who I got to know very well and only recently died. But Doris worked there for many, many years, making a lot more money than Gwilym. And it was Doris that ran the family, decided they would go on holidays because she was working so hard she needed a break. Gwilym never wanted to go anywhere, so Doris wouldn't even ask him. They went to Germany, they went all over Italy and whatever. She would just book it, package tour, and tell Gwilym later, on a certain date, "We're going here next Tuesday, the bag's packed, we're off." So Rick did quite a lot of travelling in her youth. The other members of the family, Joan. Joan was a strange one, the eldest, the prettiest, the doll. She never had to do anything. When she was, I suppose, 18, 19, 20, she married a pilot who later became, after the war, BA pilot or something like that. And I think they lived in Africa for a while. But the marriage didn't last. She had 2 children, Cornelia and Philippa. Cornelia, as you know, ran Greenpeace, and she's now married, never married for years. Tall, thin, short, butch, but looked very much like Joe. You know, skeletal head. very much like Joe, but supremely intelligent, was the managing director of Greenpeace for many, many years underneath the chap who was always on TV. She was sort of the backroom person. The other child was Philippa, the one I think that you know from New York. She married that Greek chap and they've got one child. So Cornelia's got no children. I can remember going to parties at Cornelia's house when we lived in London. The boss that she sort of on-off lived with of Greenpeace had a huge mansion in Maida Vale in Little Venice. So it was one of those huge 4 or 5 story buildings in immaculate condition, done up beautifully, and we would go there for parties and meet all these people. So Cornelia was very nice, but distant. Very nice but distant. But if you have any brains at all, they come from that side of the family. They certainly don't come from my mother's side. The dyslexia side you get from my mum, that's all. My father's side was bright but not terribly academic. Gwilym's side is where all the academia comes from. George, the second eldest. George is the one who was killed in the car crash. There was George, his wife, 3 children in the car and a grandmother down on Salisbury Plain near Salisbury. And there is a strange problem with one of the roads there, that the camber is all wrong. And he was driving somewhere and suddenly a lorry slipped across the camber, hit the car, killed everybody in the car but for Stephanie. Stephanie is the one who now lives down in Newton Abbot. She was thrown through the windscreen and survived, but facially was very damaged, and it was years and years of reconstructive surgery. George was a wheeler dealer. Nobody knew what George did. He never had a proper job of any kind. He was a salesman-y sort of person. When he was killed, Doris had to take over the whole of his affairs to try and sort them out on behalf of Stephanie. So she went down there one day to where he lived. She sold the house, but she had to clear it first. And she was climbing over things in the garage to try and find, what was there. She knew nothing about George's life at all. No one knew anything about George's life. And she found these large vats of liquid. No idea what they were, but what it turned out was they were vats of acid. And he would buy old drill bits from mining companies, shove them in the acid to get out the industrial diamonds. So the place was full of these huge vats of industrial diamonds that Doris had to then sort out, clear, get rid of the acid, find out what was in them, join all the diamonds together and then sell them. And that was her job for a long time, sorting that out. The other part of it was, of course, Stephanie's insurance claim against the insurance company for the lorry. That must have taken 10, 12 years. No thanks from Stephanie whatsoever. And she would attend meetings with solicitors who would offer them so much money, and Doris would say, no, I'm sorry, I think this is worth more. So in the end she did the deal for Stephanie, who wasn't grateful, and at the end of it all wanted Doris investigated to make sure that all the expenses that she claimed against the estate, Doris doesn't drive, as you know, so if she took transport to solicitors in London, she would claim that as expenses, and Stephanie made her go through everything to make sure she hadn't claimed anything she wasn't entitled to, which at that time really, really teed off Gwilym, because Doris was absolutely honest. As you know, she would be absolutely honest with any member of the family, and all the work, the weeks, hours, days, years she put in, Stephanie felt were as of nothing. So Gwilym was really upset with that. George, that's the one that was killed. Doris, Joe, well, you know Joe, so I don't have to talk to you about Joe. Gwilym's side. Gwilym David Jones, born I think the same year as my dad, 1913, I think he was, in Brynaman in Wales, near Cardiff, South Wales. Didn't speak English until he was 13. 11 brothers, 1 sister, Gladys. I don't know much about the brothers. They were very tight together, lived together, rugby played together, and were just a group of lads together. The mother and father, I think the father died, and the mother moved to London when Gwilym was 12, 13, taking Gwilym with her. He was the last son and the cherished favourite. The family, the mother's family, not the Joneses, wasn't Welsh. It was the Joneses that were Welsh. She had a Swiss grandmother and money. That's where your mum's name Frederica came from, Swiss, the grandmother. But Gwilym's mother, no Welsh in her at all. And her family came from Frinton on the northeast coast, Southend, up somewhere like that, and mega wealthy. Huge amounts of estates up there in Frinton, which Gwilym actually went to see with Doris. But by the time her mother came around, the money was gone. Hundreds of acres, hundreds and hundreds of acres of land, millionaires they would have been, all gone. So Gwilym had nothing apart from bits of silver and jewellery. When Gwilym's mother died, he would have been in his 20s. He inherited most of the stuff. The other sons had all long gone, had their own families. So he inherited all his mother's jewellery and all the family's silver. Lots of it. He handed it to Gladys. He said, you know, I'm a man, I'm a bloke, I haven't got anywhere to wear jewellery. So here we are, Gladys, look after this. You know, one day I may call for it back, but I've got no family, you have it. Gladys married a drunk. Later on, when Doris said to Gwilym, I think you better get the jewellery and the silver back before it's been drunk away, that jewellery and stuff should be Rick's, he went to Gladys, who said, I'm sorry, it's gone. Whoever he is, the husband, I can't remember the name, has drunk a lot. I've had to pawn it and it's all gone. There wasn't a scrap of it left. So, that was Gladys. The only brother that I knew, and I knew quite well, was Lull. Don't know what his full name was. Lull was extremely thin, tall, very, very intelligent, and he was the father of David, the one that you know who now lives in Amsterdam with the cancer, who was the scientist with the, what is it, the Strobe something or other machine. There was another daughter who lived in South Africa, I think. Again, very intelligent. I've met her loads of times. She was very nice. But those are the two from that. They were the super intelligent doctorates. One of the other sons had, similar to Matt, problems like Matt, and he recently committed suicide. But he was very intelligent as well. Gwyn that was, committed suicide. So that's all that lot. I'm just thinking if there's anything else from them. No, that's Doris's family. I'm going to see if Doris can do you one of these as well. I'll give her the tablet and see if she can do one, because she'll know the names. When Doris's mother, Gwilym's mother, died, he also inherited a huge suitcase full of photographs. The little Victorian ones in the little gilt frames, the daguerreotypes, the glass prints of family members. And he was the only one who knew all these people were. And long before he got his emphysema and became really ill, she said to him, Gwilym, you must write the names of all these people on these pictures, because otherwise we will never know who they are. And I don't think he ever got round to it. What he did do was a huge family tree of his mother's side, basically. The Joneses down in Wales were nothing. It was his mother's side. And that, of course, connected through to the Dutch royal family, the Nassaus, as you know, and Doris somewhere has this huge family tree that you probably find later on in your life a little bit interesting. They got to a stage back in about 1780 that they just could get no further. Gwilym spent months and months up in all sorts of places in Somerset House, records offices. They travelled all over the country looking for records in parish churches of deaths and whatever. And they then got to a stage that they could get no further. And 2 or 3 months later, Gwilym said, I'll have to give this up. You know, I can't find anything. And they were then contacted by a chap called Hans from Holland. And he had been doing the Dutch royal family, William of Orange, back from William of Orange. They'd got all the Dutch ancestors, but William of Orange's younger brother came to England before William of Orange was made King of England. And the younger brother came, and Hans said, I can't find any trace or record other than this one family, and I think it's connected to you. So Gwilym wrote back to Hans and said, well, funnily enough, I've got that relative all the way to me and to my daughter, but I haven't got anywhere beyond that relative. So Hans flew to England to meet them, and they tied up the 2 pieces of the family tree. So now I think Doris has got the whole thing right back to William of Orange, hence when you were born, Nassau was put into your family name. Spencer, your other name, was in fact another of Gwilym's brothers. It was Gwilym's favourite brother. I think he was the eldest, the biggest. He was big, and I think Gwilym just loved Spencer beyond anything. And I think Spencer got killed somewhere, but that's why you were Spencer and Nassau, because 2 of Gwilym's most favourite names. The Lloyd, Rick, always known as Rick, even though her name was Frederica. Gwilym hated it being shortened. He always wanted everybody to call her Frederica, after his grandmother and his mother, and hated it being shortened. Rick hated it being shortened. She didn't like Rick. What she hated worst of all was Fred. Lots of people called her Fred. She hated that more than anything. So when you were born, we had, my name's Geoffrey, but always been called Jeff. Elizabeth, always called Libby. Julia, always called Jew. Rebecca, always called Beck. So we decided that we would choose a name that could never be shortened. So we bought a book of names, and we went from A to Z, and Rick went through, and she chose